All right, welcome back to the next lesson. This one's going to be on movement and support, and so this is critical for animals. In fact, it's one of the pillars of being an animal is that you're able to move around and get your food, right? And so, what a privilege it is to be able to move around and not only get our food, but even go to places that we like to go and make movements that we like to move around that are pleasing to move. So I don't know if any of you are into gymnastics or sports. Obviously, those are movements that we do for pleasure, and so it's a privilege to be able to move around and to do what we want. And so it's awesome that we have that flexibility to move. And so I encourage you to move. Don't sit. You were given muscles and bones for a reason. And so, again, that's a privilege. And bones are an awesome way to support us. And we'll talk about bones and how we are supported by our endoskeleton and the bones that make our endoskeleton and some of the dynamics of how the muscles interact with the bones and such. And so before we get into the lecture, though, I just wanted to give a little credit to our Creator for designing us that way. And I found some interesting stuff in the Bible too when I was looking up Bible verses about like bones or movement or support, as I typically like to do, read a Bible verse. And I found a few that talked about how Jesus' bones were not broken. That was prophesied actually before his death. And it's interesting that, we don't need to dive super deep on the significance of that, but it is interesting that his bones were not broken, as though that was symbolic, maybe, perhaps, of that kind of support never not being actually broken. He was pierced, he was killed, he was humiliated, there's 15 adjectives there in the verse, but his bones were not broken. Not one of his bones were broken. And so, again, there's some significance there, I think, to that. But let's get into the lesson now. And so, animals are created with different systems for moving around and being supported. First of all, you have to be supported. If you're not supported, you ain't moving. And that can even be simple. In fact, that's what we'll do, is start with the most simple. But these two go together. Movement and support go together. In fact, one of them kind of sort of dictates how well the other can be done, right? How well you're supported can kind of dictates how well you can move around. And so there's 3 types of skeletons we'll look at. We'll answer that question, and then we'll really look at the dynamics of how muscles interact with bones so that we can move. So that how do muscles enable movement? The first most simple skeleton would be a hydrostatic skeleton. And a hydrostatic skeleton is dependent upon water. It has to have water. It basically is using water as its skeleton, sort of. So water is like the key component there, but another one is the muscles. So it has to have some muscles that are on the outside. And basically these muscles will move and contract and get smaller or squeeze. And if you've ever held a water balloon like this is an organism called a hydra. And basically, it's almost like a little water balloon. It's got little tentacles on it or whatever, but it's like a water balloon. And if you were to squeeze a water balloon, or the hydra was to squeeze itself and squeeze this water, where would the water go? It has to go somewhere, right? Because remember, it's contained within this structure here. And so it would just elongate. So you hold a round water balloon in your hand and you squeeze it, it's going to elongate. Even a balloon with air would do that. Air is technically a fluid. In engineering terms, we call it fluid dynamics, and it has even air is considered somewhat of a fluid. And so again, it's important that these hydrostatic skeletons have water, but that they also have muscles that can squeeze on the water to make the organism take its shape. And so we're not going to go into all the details here, but there's times and places when this organism wants to be like this, and times and places when the organism wants to be like this, right? If it's digesting food, it's probably going to relax and do its digestion. But once it's done and it wants to move around, it's probably going to elongate and then shorten and elongate and shorten and elongate to maybe move around in the water. And so there will be different times when this organism will take different shapes, but it's basically because water, again, is not compressible. That's kind of one of the key points there. Water is not compressible, so if you squeeze it, it's got to go somewhere. All right, let's see. Now it does have a mouth, so it could actually let the water out if it wanted to, and so it often sits in the position for hours like this right here. But if it's disturbed, its mouth will open, allowing water to flow out, and longitudinal cells in the body wall contract, shortening the body, as in the right photo. So basically, I'm sorry, I had that wrong. A hydra often sits in this position right here for hours on the left, and then when the mouth opens and lets a lot of this water out, and the cells on the outside relax, contract. They would need to contract, right? They would need to contract. Then the organism will be in this shape, shortening the body. And so, but if these muscles, contract or relax, they're basically going to be moving the water around. And there's different organisms that have this type of hydrostatic skeleton. One that we looked at a few sections ago in the digestive section was cnidarians, or I say cnidarians, I think the C is silent. Cnidarians, like jellyfish or sea anemones. Here's a sea anemone. You probably saw a lot of these in Monterey Bay when you were there, and they're very colorful and pretty with the tentacles moving around and stuff when there's water present. But when there's no water present, then again, hydrostatic skeletons need water to take shape. So you probably saw some sea anemones maybe where there wasn't water if the tide was low or whatever, and these things just look like a little blob of little. There's always like little shells and rocks stuck to the blob too, so you almost can't even see them when the water's not there. But when there's water around, then the water can be pumped in and pumped out, and these muscles can contract and move water around, and they can take shape like this. So they're really pretty when there's water around. And jellyfish would be another example of an organism that has a hydrostatic skeleton. So here's a jellyfish, and they basically need water to have this shape. Now they have a hydrostatic skeleton. There's not really any rigidity to it. Moving on to the next two type of skeletons, now we're going to be starting to talk about skeletons that have rigidity, or that are rigid or hard. And these are pretty easy because they contrast each other. Like you have an exo and an endo. You have exoskeletons, which are for like smaller insects and stuff we'll talk about. And then you have endoskeletons that are going to be for organisms that are large. And so the skeletons will be inside. And so it's all about the prefix. Exo means outside, endo means inside. And so for exoskeletons, where the skeleton is on the outside, you can pretty much think of all of your insects. Insects is a class in the phylum Arthropod, and so many arthropods have exoskeletons, as do most mollusks and snails and clams. And so it's an external skeleton. It's a hard body covering made of a complex carbohydrate called chitin, right? So the complex carbohydrate would be the polymer of monomers, which are sugars in this case, because it's a carbohydrate. The monomers are like glucose, but a little bit different than glucose. Replace one of the OH groups with the amine, and you'll have glucosamine, and a chain of glucosamines will make chitin, and chitin will then bond to other molecules of chitin in a pretty strong attraction way through hydrogen bonding and such. And anyways, without going into all that detail, chitin is a tough material, and so that would make up the exoskeleton of most of those organisms, but some, like shells, like for mollusks, if anyone of you ever collected seashells or seen someone that has a seashell collection, you notice they're a little bit harder than like the exoskeleton of like a cricket or something like that, and that's because they actually are made of calcium carbonate, which our bones are made of. We'll talk about that down here. But point is of exoskeletons is that it's on the outside. Now let's talk about some advantages and disadvantages. So advantages are they're watertight, so you have a nice little waterproof covering, right? So if it's raining or there's like acids around or solutions that might be harmful, the organism's somewhat protected because they have a hard shell that the water or solution will just run off of. So it's a nice physical barrier from the outside. Okay, some organisms are so tough that other organisms won't even want to eat it because the exoskeleton is so tough, and so it's a nice protection from predators, like crabs, for example. Or mollusks, yeah. If you've seen mollusks with the two-part shells, they're the bivalves. Those things, it takes a lot of work to get those open, but nonetheless, they still get eaten, don't they? And so another good thing about the bivalves too, since they're watertight, they can make watertight seals. Is bivalves can actually have sort of the opposite effect, where they keep water in so that they don't dry out. They can be so sealed that the water can't really escape, and that makes them not dry out if, let's say, it's like a low tide or something like that. Okay, exoskeletons have some disadvantages, though, that far outweigh the advantages of being a watertight seal. Exoskeletons are extremely heavy in proportion to the body weight. So I'm addressing that first. I know that it addresses another thing first, but then it addresses this, but I'm addressing this first because I think it's the most important, honestly, is that it's extremely heavy because you have to cover the whole surface, the outside surface of your body. So imagine walking around with like body armor everywhere. Like, it would be extremely heavy and bulky and annoying. And so with proportion to the body weight, exoskeletons are just not very efficient. The second reason is, and this is also pretty huge, is that they don't really grow. They don't grow with the organism. So if the organism, like this cicada, is like a locust, if it's going to grow, then it can grow, but it needs to get rid of that exoskeleton and then form a new one. And that's not a good, that's very inefficient. I remember growing up, these things would be all over our fence and driveway and all over the trees, and you would think it's a living cicada, and then you go touch it and you realize, oh, it's just the shell. And they do that once or twice a year or whatever. There'd be seasons for molting. This process is called molting, by the way. It's a vocab word. And it's basically when arthropods break out of their exoskeleton to grow a new one. And so that makes the organism also very vulnerable, because when the organism looks like this, wouldn't you want to eat that? And it's funny, there's a lot of people that actually eat locusts. It's actually locusts and honey. It's a biblical, you can find that in the Bible. I think there's a few stories where locusts and honey are mentioned. But if you were another predator, though, that ate this like primarily, that would look yummy and be easy to eat because it's like soft and fleshy. But if it had the exoskeleton, it would have a little bit more protection. This locust would, this cicada would have a little bit more protection. So this thing's got to hide out for a while the outside starts to be reformed. So it'll take a little bit of time for that chitin or whatever to develop, and then it'll have to do it all over again the next year or whatever. So extremely inefficient because they're heavy and they don't grow with the organism. So they obviously can't get that large, can they? Organisms that want to get large will have endoskeletons that are inside the organism. Endo means inside, and so endoskeletons are made of calcium carbonate, like our bones, and they are going to grow with the organism. So babies are born with bones that are obviously tiny, And I did find it interesting. I found even a verse in Ecclesiastes that was talking about, you know, uh, have you ever, have you contemplated, how bones can be formed in a mother's womb? So it's interesting that babies have literally, pregnant women are walking around with babies inside of them that have bones, like hard bones, and that baby's got to get out. And so, interestingly enough, a baby's born with bones around the skull that make up the skull. The bones that make up the skull are actually like in pieces so that they can flex. That's why babies will come out like with a cone head shape, so they can fit through the cervix. And so then later on in life, those bones will fuse together, and then you'll have one skull. But there'll be like pieces, like skull plates. And in fact, if you look at an adult skull, you'll see the lines where the plates have met finally. But and that makes babies vulnerable too in the beginning, because there'll be a little soft spot where they technically don't have a a bone surrounding their brain. There's just some fluid there, but so you have to be careful with that soft spot. But the point I'm trying to make is that babies are born with tiny bones, and then as they get older, those bones can grow, and the organism can basically get as large as they want. Hopefully that doesn't happen too fast, because even still, with an endoskeleton, organisms can have what are called growing pains. Any of you that have gone through puberty recently may experience this, or this can really happen kind of in any stage of life, I guess. But anytime your tissues grow really fast, it can actually be kind of painful, because in fact babies actually get this a lot. Babies will go through growth spurts, and it's kind of painful. There's studies that show, or at least suggest, that it's a tremendous amount of pain and there's extra crying going on when babies are going through those growth spurts, because everything's growing really quickly and pulling on everything else. And so bones, they need to grow, and they can grow and allow us to get very large. We'll talk about the relationship between muscles and bones in just a second, but one thing to point out is that it's your vertebrates that are going to have endoskeletons, but also even echinoderms. That's another phylum, another animal phylum that makes up the sea stars. And this is interesting. If you asked me and I wasn't paying attention, I'd have probably told you that the sea star has an exoskeleton, because they're pretty tough on the outside. But now that I've taught this chapter for a few years, and I've actually gone to Monterey Bay for a few years and touched some living sea stars, not the ones you buy in the souvenir shop, but a living sea star actually does have a little bit of flesh on the outside. It's almost like shark skin. It's kind of not soft. It's kind of like a tough, leathery, like skin. So it's really thin, and it sits right on top of these skeletal plates here. And so technically, this would fit the definition of an endoskeleton. If you do a Google search, you'll probably find some people that claim that it has both, or just an exo, or just an endo. You'll see people argue. Again, we try our best to draw lines and boundaries, but by definition here, this would have an endoskeleton, because these skeletal plates are inside of these legs here. So echinoderms, one of the things that makes echinoderms, if you look at the definition of that phylum, is that it has radial symmetry like this. So all these arms are coming out from the center like this. So no matter how you look at this thing, it's always symmetrical in a radial fashion, right? So, okay, moving on. Pretty cool is that you can actually look at a vertebrate skeleton and really kind of tell what movements that it probably did, whether it flew, ran, jumped, swim, or whatever. And so you can kind of analyze the joints, which we'll talk about now. If an animal's rigid skeleton were made of one piece, then obviously it couldn't move, right? If you look at a skeleton at like Party City or something like that for Halloween, it's probably just going to be like in one piece, and it's going to be a poor representation. But if you look at like a classroom, a skeleton in a classroom like Miss Williams has, or Mr. Knowlton had, or that are in a university setting or whatever, you've probably seen them. Those are more fun, because you can move the legs around and you can move the arms around, and you can it's not all just one big piece. But yet all the bones still have to be attached to each other, right? So how do you attach bones to bones without making it rigid? How do you do that? Well, if you look closely at the models in classrooms, there's a little wire or something like that is like tied to both of the bones so that they can still be next to each other, but yet still not be touching each other and connected to each other in a way that they can't move. And so those in the real life, those connective tissues, we call ligaments. We call them ligaments. Now there's another type of connective tissue we call tendons, that a lot of people get these two confused. And so if there's one thing I can teach you in this lesson that I hope you take with you the rest of your life, is the difference between a ligament and a tendon. There's a lot of adults that don't know that. And I've forgotten it many times in my life too. But I will never forget it now because I have a way of memorizing it, and I've taught it for a few years. So ligaments and tendons we'll go over. First, look at ligaments first. Ligaments, again, they connect bone to bone, bone to bone. And in a short sense, while we're not talking about it, tendons connect muscle to bone. So stay tuned for that. But for right now, we're talking about ligaments that connect bone to bone. And they do that, obviously, at joints, because that's what joints are. Joints are regions places where the skeletons are held together in ways that enable them to move. You have different types of joints. We're not going to go into that in this lesson, but you have your ball and socket joint, your hinge joint, and all that. But one of the real common joints that you have is your, let's make sure you guys can still see this, is your knee joint. So your knee joint is super complex. It's got a lot going on. And so let's look at the knee joint for a second, if this will ever show up or give me anything. Well, I sure hope this video is recording. Looks like it is. I have an internet connection. I don't know what happened to my internet though. Come on, Google. Okay. I had all of these images and websites already pulled up, ready to go. And here we are. I don't know what happened, or why I'm not even getting anything at all here when I try to start over. Let's just do this. ACL, and we'll do knee joints, or knee joint. If you look at your knee, it's got all kinds of ligaments, not just one, because your knee is doing a lot of different motions here. And so you have your, those are meniscuses, but let's look at ligaments. Oh, I already had really good pictures pulled up, but it's okay. Hopefully I can find them again. Let's see. I want the... Wow, look at... So this is something you might see in like anatomy and physiology. You can really start dissecting this thing down into all kinds of things to label. But if we want to find a good one, I think this one's pretty good. You got your meniscuses in here, but you also got your bones labeled, like the femur and your tibia and fibia, which are on your bottom side of your leg. Your femur is the big bone, largest bone on your top part of your leg. And so here's your knee. Patella is like the kneecap, and so you have all these different ligaments. You've got your lateral collateral ligament, I like that, lateral collateral, that holds your fibia to your femur. You've got your another medial lateral ligament that holds your femur to your tibia, and then you've got these like small little ligaments in here. You've got your anterior cruciate ligament and your posterior cruciate ligament here. Well, it's this anterior cruciate ligament that oftentimes people will tear that. And so if we typed in ACL, might as well just go to those pictures. Basically, an ACL will basically tear under a lot of stress. So whether you're putting too much stress on the muscles that are pulling the bones, and you do that too quickly. So like landing, but yet landing with a lot of weight, and then you're trying to hold that weight from hitting the ground, but yet you're still bending your knees. That happening really quickly can tear that ligament, and then you have to replace that, because this is a tough connective tissue, and getting that to heal is pretty difficult. People that tear their ACL usually live with this the rest of their life, and so but it can be fixed. I mean, they can do a graft, or they sew or regraft new tendon here to fix. I'm sorry, not tendon, ligament, new ligament there. Remember, ligaments go bone to bone like this, or they can do all sorts of reconstructions. I don't know. I'm not an expert on ACL reconstructions, and I hope I don't ever have to get one, because again, they're often surgeries that people have to live with the rest of their life. Sometimes it looks like they can take the ligament and bring it back up and drill a hole and retie it and do all kinds of reconstructives. But the point is, we got a lot of ligaments here. The way I remember bone to bone and ligaments is ligament. It kind of sounds like leg, ligament. And so since you have a lot of ligaments here in your leg, at this joint, that's how I remember bone to bone. That's how I remember bone to bone. So I don't know if that makes sense to you. It probably doesn't. You might have to find your own way of memorizing that. But always remember that ligaments go from bone to bone. They connect bones together so that we still have movement here, but yet these bones are connected to each other. In fact, what makes this such a bad story is if this gets torn, then you have less connection between this bone and this bone, so it's more like free floating. And that's actually what happens is people that have these injuries will be walking around and their knee is kind of weak or wobbly and squirrely, because there's no structure there. There's no support. There's no connection between this bone and this bone. I mean, there's still this ligament and the collateral ligaments and even the posterior ligament, but still this ACL is critical. And if that's torn, then these bones are just kind of free floating there. And even though your muscles are there to help support as well, it's just going to be less support. And so people will oftentimes get a further injury because their ACL was messed up. And so this stuff will start sliding past each other, and other ligaments will get damaged. Things will start coming out of sockets, and yeah, it's all bad. It's all bad. You get a lot of swelling and inflammation, and usually it's really painful to walk. And so here's a pretty cool illustration of ACL reconstructive surgery. But back to the lesson here, ligaments are going to be at all your joints connecting bone to bone. Okay, so at the joints, you still need to make that motion happen. So if you're going to make that motion happen, how is it going to happen? Bones don't move themselves, and it's going to be muscles that are able to do that. Muscles are what generate the force. Muscles are going to be the specialized tissues that literally produce the physical force by contracting or getting shorter when they're stimulated. Now, I don't like that sentence. I really hate that sentence, actually. Muscles, they do one thing when they're stimulated. They contract. They don't get shorter by stimulation. They naturally get shorter by relaxing. If you're not applying energy to a muscle... No, I'm sorry. Wait, no, that is right. They contract or get shorter. Contracting and getting shorter mean the same thing. When they relax, they get longer again. It's actually the opposite of a rubber band. A lot of teachers will use rubber bands as an analogy for muscles, and it's the worst. It's the worst analogy for muscles, because you apply energy to lengthen the rubber band, and then when you stop applying energy, the rubber band goes back to a shorter, more relaxed state. But muscles are the opposite. You apply energy and they contract. They get smaller. And then when you stop applying energy to a muscle, it relaxes, but then it gets loose and long again. Does that make sense? It's hard to find things in nature that do that, except for springs are probably the best analogy. Springs are the best analogy. I'm sorry, it's not hard to find things in nature like that. Springs are the best analogy for muscles. When you apply energy, it will contract. It will get smaller, and then without energy applied, it will loosen up. So why is that important? Okay, we'll watch and look. When you need to move a joint, you have to remember that the only thing muscles can do is contract. And so they have to pull on bones. They have to pull on bones to make that work. And so in that case, we are never going to use a muscle to directly attach to a bone. You will always have a tendon that will be kind of like the liaison or the go-between for a muscle and a tendon. And this image is just terrible. So let's go to Google where we got way better images. And I want to show you the tendons in your hand, and it also give you another way to memorize this. If you're ever trying to remember tendons and ligaments, tendons go from muscle to bone, and some of the most important tendons are the tendons in your hand. If you're thinking about tendons, and in fact, if we were in school, I'd be passing around chicken feet right now, and you guys would be holding chicken feet and pulling on the tendons. And so this is interesting. And not a lot of people understand this, but let me find a good image here of how this works and why the hand is such a good way to remember. Oh, and the way I remember it is you have 10 fingers, and so if you have 10 things to do, you have 10 things that need to be done, and you've got 10 fingers to do those 10 things that need to be done, then 10 done, 10 done, 10. That's how I remember to focus on the hand, because they got the 10 fingers, and then your hand, you got all these tendons. And so the way it works, this is probably a pretty good image here. Yeah. No, let's go to this one. Yeah, here's a good one. So you've got 1, 2, 3. I'm reading that backwards if these are actually numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4. But you've got even more than that. 5, 6, 7 different tendons that are coming from your fingers and going up into your arm. And so when you need to pull on a finger, when you need to make a finger move in any of these joints here in your knuckles, believe it or not, it's not actually the muscles in your hand that do that. A lot of people don't know this. And I have, in many times in my life, forgotten it as well. And so I think this is a pretty good picture that illustrates it. You have all of these tendons that are like cords that run to your fingers, but the muscles that move your fingers are in your forearm. They're in your forearm. Now, are there muscles in your hand? Sure, there are muscles in your hand. In fact, this picture shows that. There's a muscle there that can, here's how you tell what a joint is going to do. Look at the muscle and remember that the only thing it can do is contract. If this thing gets smaller, if this red thing gets smaller, this muscle gets smaller, what's going to happen? This is going to get closer to that. Okay? So if you were to go like this and kind of like move your thumb in, if you were to move your thumb in like that or kind of taco your hand a little bit, those would be what the muscles in your hand do. They don't move your fingers. It doesn't feel like it, right? When you move your fingers, you feel like you're moving muscles right here in your fingers, but there are no muscles in your fingers. The only muscles in your hand are kind of here in your palm, but they just kind of help shape your palm a little bit or contort your palm a little bit. But if you move your fingers, you're using the muscles in your forearm, and here's how you tell. And just put your hand on your forearm, or if you dare, grab your forearm pretty tight. Grab it real tight and then move your fingers. You can feel all the muscles in your forearm being contracting. And so what's actually happening is, have you ever seen those puppets that you hold, like the piece of wood, and it has all the strings hanging down from the wood, and you can like manipulate the wood and move the strings up and down, and it makes the limbs move. That's kind of what tendons are like. Tendons are attached to your fingers, And imagine having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 cords running into your fingers at different spots and attached, and then you were able to pull on those strings. What would happen? Well, if the string was all the way at my tip of my middle finger, then it would want to curl like that, right? But what if it was only attached to right there? Then that's what allows my finger to go like that. Because if I go like that and want to curl all the way, I've got to pull from right there, don't I, the tip? But if I want to just pull from right here, then I can, if I had a string attached to that, I could pull the string and my finger would go like that, right? That's why the best thing to do is just pass out those chicken feet I get from the store. Believe it or not, a lot of people make soup out of chicken feet. And if you get them from the store, they're cut off right here at the wrist, and all the little tendons are hanging out. And so you can just grab some tweezers and pull on the tendons, and some of them will go like that. So you've actually got tendons attached to the top of your bones in your fingers here too, so that when you pull on the tendon, the finger goes up. If you pull on the tendons that are attached this way, then when you pull on the tendon, your fingers will curl in. You've actually got a whole bunch of tendons in your wrist that attach to the bones in your fingers at all your different knuckles and joints that allow your hands to be so flexible, which is super awesome. I love working with my hands. I work on cars and I play the guitar. There's a lot of things I like to do with my hands, and so I praise God that my fingers can move and be so flexible. But if you want strong hands, it's all in your forearms. Your forearms, those muscles in your forearms are what contract and get smaller that allow you to pull on the strings, okay? If I was to pull on a string, I'm technically using muscles here, but if the string is attached in my arm and I want to pull on the string, then I need muscles in my arm right here, my forearm, to do that. And so, again, it's all about applying a force, which is what muscles do. Muscles apply a force, and they pull on tendons, which then pull on bones. So, let's see if we can find a good picture of that. Muscles in forearm and hand. And they'll probably just by default show the tendons as well. This one looks good. Now, with you know how we talked about there's so many different tendons? Well, that means that for each tendon, there's actually going to have to be a muscle for that tendon as well. So that's why you don't just have one forearm muscle. You've got lots of different striations of muscles in your forearm, each one doing a different job. Sorry, if I had all this stuff already saved, which I did, it would be easier to zoom in and zoom out. This one's already zoomed in. Perfect. So you see how this muscle here is going to only pull on this tendon, which might be the one that goes to the knuckle up top here. And so it's going to make the finger go up. This muscle here is pulling on this tendon, which looks like it ultimately ends up right here. And notice some tendons even converge together, so that's why you can kind of move two fingers at once. And you can train these muscles up here too. Like when you're born, these aren't very trained or well developed, and that's why babies don't have a ton of like good control of their hands and can voluntarily. But even as an adult, try moving some of your fingers independently of each other. Try moving just your pinky without moving your ring finger. Like that might be difficult because you haven't trained these muscles yet, but if you play the guitar or play the piano, you've trained your fingers to move independently of other fingers. So you can train that but you're developing muscles in your forearm. You're strengthening muscles in your forearm by increasing a demand for them, and so they'll grow and you'll have more voluntary control. But all the muscles that move your fingers are up in your forearm, and they pull on tendons, and then the tendons pull on the bone. That's important because muscles, if they attached directly to the bone, that wouldn't be very efficient. The connective tissue here, in this case, which is a tendon, is a better go-between, because the tendon can attach really good to the muscle, and it can also attach really good to the bone. And then allow it to be a little bit more flexible. You wouldn't want to have muscle attached directly to the bone, and you'd have a lot of tears and things like that, and it's just not the way we're engineered. And so again, in anatomy and physiology, you would learn what each one of these muscles do. Now, is there a popular tendon? Sure, one that gets torn a lot. If any of you are in sports, you may have torn your Achilles tendon, and this is one that gets torn. Well, I'll ask you, and make you contemplate that. First, let me tell you where it's at. So your Achilles tendon is what attaches your calf muscle to the back of your heel. So there's a ball of your heel here, and there's an Achilles tendon here that attaches to the ball of your heel. But then, and it's quite large here. It's quite large and thick. It attaches to the ball of your heel and comes up to your calf muscle. And so if your calf muscle gets smaller, then this muscle can pull on this tendon. If it pulls on this tendon, what's it going to pull on? It's going to pull on this bone, which is going to make your foot do what? Point down, right? It's going to be pulling on the heel, which pulls the heel up, which then makes the toes go down. So it's basically when you walk and you take a step, and you there's got to be a good picture of that here somewhere. Yeah, there you go. When you take a step like that, this muscle is pulling on this tendon to pull that up, right? If you want to have your heel come up like that, this muscle has to pull on this tendon. Well, imagine doing that really quickly and you're really strong. And maybe your calf muscles are super strong and you go to not just run, but let's say jump. And so this happens in basketball a lot. People that will jump up will put a ton of energy into this muscle in an instant. To try to get a high jump. Well, what it'll do is it'll tear this tendon. And then you probably saw as I was scrolling through some pictures of that, of what that looks like. And again, it's something that can be fixed. But this is a nasty one. When you tear this, what happens is, because it's very elastic, the muscle will actually ball up into a ball inside of your leg, and you'll see like just kind of a ball in the calf muscle, and all of this tendon will just coil back up. And what the surgeon has to do is reach up and find it. He has to find the tendon up here, pull it back down, and then suture it together and reconnect it, and then your body will obviously rebuild tissue so that it'll reconnect. But yeah, that's what happens when you have an Achilles tendon tear. I think this was the best picture. You basically just and you don't have to have a complete tear either. Even if you do a partial tear, you'll get a bunch of inflammation and a bunch of pain and stuff like that. So cool. So you have tendons and ligaments. Know the difference. Tendons connect muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. And basically, when you want to move, you're going to use the muscles. Now, just going back to the exoskeletons real quick, though, they also have muscles too. But since they don't have bones to pull on, they don't have an endoskeleton, those muscles basically attach somewhere to the exoskeleton at the joint so that it can do motion that way. Not super efficient, though. Vertebrate muscular skeletal systems. Again, you got diversity. That's all this paragraph, I think, addresses, is that every organism has different bone structures and muscle structures that allow the organism to adapt. And of course, this textbook goes into evolution, saying that it all has to do with the organism's ability to find food and get food and find a niche and find a niche in its ecosystem that it can occupy. Remember, no two species occupy the same niche in an ecosystem. So there you go. There you have it. Movement and support. Thank God we are created to move. That being said, I'm going to get up and move now. Thank you for watching this video. Bye-bye.